Hello, it's ukulele time. I'm Ben Eagle, Adult Services Librarian and ukulele teacher. And today we're going to look at 7th chords, some of the most common chords played outside of major and minor. So I'll talk about what they are. I'll show you some examples in songs and popular music and folk music, and then show you how they're extensively used in blues music. So with that, let's get started. So what is the 7th chord? 7th chord is also called the dominant 7th chord, but it's most oftenly just referred to as the 7th chord, because there's other kinds of 7th chords, but this is the most commonly used one. So it's often just written with a 7 at the end. So you'll see the chord symbol, whatever the letter of the chord is, with the 7 at the end. And the 7th chord is made of 4 different notes. So most of your major and minor chords are just 3-note chords. You might think, well, I'm playing 4 strings when I'm playing most of these chords. But with all those chords, you're likely repeating, well, you are repeating at least 1 note in there. So with the C, you have a C and a C here. And then you have 2 other different notes in that chord. So the 7th chord is a 4-note chord. It's that major chord, but then it has an extension on it. An extension being an added note. So that added note is the 7th interval. We talked about intervals. You can think about them sort of as like the numbers of a scale. For now, you can think of it as being like the 7th tone of a scale, because there's 7 notes in most of the scales used in popular Western music. So it's a 4-note chord with a 7th added. So it'll sound a lot like its regular chord. So here's a C, and it's okay if you don't hear the difference right away, and here's a C7. So it has that added note in there. And what that does is it gives the chord more tension. So I'll talk about how we use that in a 1-4-5 progression, how that tension brings you back to your 1 chord. So just as a quick refresher, that 1-4-5 progression comes from their numbers in the scale. I talked in a previous lesson about how each of those places in the scale has their own number. So on the screen, just as a refresher, you'll see the 1, 2, 3, the Roman numerals on the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then it starts over on 1. So the 1-4-5 are the chords that are built off of the C, the F, and the G, and the key of C. So the first note in the scale, the 4th, and the 5th. So you'll see the 7th most commonly used on that 5. So it's often used interchangeably with the 5, or in addition to it. So in the key of C, you might be playing that G7 instead of a G when you play the G in a chord progression. And I'll show you that just adds a little bit more tension. So if you're playing a progression in 1-4-5, I'll do a simple thing like, so that was all with just the major chords. But if we replace the G with the G7, it'll sound similar, but it'll just give it a little bit more tension. So you'll have, so that G wants to pull back to the 1, the first note in there. Now the 1-4-5 progression is like the building block of all chord progressions. So the reason I keep coming back to that chord progression is if you can hear those different chords in there, that's a good place to start your ear training, to hear popular songs and be able to pick them up by ear. So a lot of most songs use those chords in some fashion. Some songs only use those chords throughout it. So a good little thing to think about when you're trying to listen for the 1, 4, 5 when you're playing along is the 1 chord is like your home. The 4 chord is like away from home, or like a vacation home maybe. So it still feels comfortable and kind of in place. But then when you go to the 5 chord, that's the one, it doesn't want to just stay on that chord. If you're listening, it wants to resolve, it wants to come back to that 1 chord. So 1 is your home, 4 is away from home, and 5, you're coming home, you're trying to get there. And then if you want to add that 7th chord, it's like the last few steps to get there. So that 7 chord just adds more attention. So you can use both, just the regular chord, then the extension for the 7, or you can just use the 7 in place of that 5 chord, the G7 in the key of C. So next we'll look at how to play some of these 7 chords. Now before I show each of the chords that we'll be working on, I want to bring up this sheet on the screen. It's kind of similar to the last lesson where I went through the Roman numerals of each chord. So you can see where the 1, 4, 5 on these common keys on the ukulele are. The key of C, the key of G, the key of D, and the key of F. So the 7 chords we're looking at today, most of them will be those 5 chords in there. So in the key of C, we'll be playing G7, in the key of G, D7, D will be A7, and F will be C7. So now we'll look at some of these chords. So there's a few extras with the chord sheet included with this lesson. So these are just some of the most common used ones on there. Because I'm going to show you in a moment that the 7 isn't only used on the 5 chord. It's just most frequently used on the 5 chord. Now in blues music and jazz music, but first started in blues, the 7 is used on other chords, and I'll show that with a blues progression, what that sounds like with 7s. But first let's look at how to play some of these. So the G is kind of like a mirror image of the G we already learned. So you'll notice the fingering is a little different. To play that mirror image, you start with your 2nd finger on the 3rd string, 1st finger on the 2nd string on the 1st fret, and 3rd finger on the 1st string. Now I won't play every one of these chords. I'll mostly just stick to the ones in C. You can work on these yourself if you're playing in different keys. So that's the G7. So when you go from G to G7, you have to change your fingering a little bit. Now I'm going to skip ahead to the C, because that's an easier one. So when you're playing a C7 instead of a C, instead of your 3rd finger, you're just putting your 1st finger on the 1st string. Now you might most commonly hear that in the key of F, because that 7 chord would want to bring you back to the F. So in the key of F, you might hear something like. Okay, and then let's see, two more I'll show you. The D7, because that's in the key of G. You'd be playing that frequently. Now this one also has an alternate fingering in there. As I said previously, sometimes you repeat notes in a chord. So the D7, the easier fingering, is just with the open third string. And that's shown on the screen. But you might also play it as a bar chord, if you're comfortable doing bar chords. And it's the same chord, it's just playing different octaves of different notes in there. So it's a different voicing, as they would say. Just gives you a little bit different sound. So that's actually the same chord, just within a little bit different arrangement of notes. So that would be in the key of G if you're doing a 1-4-5. G. That's the bar chord version. The two-finger version. So that's some of the most common 7 chords on this sheet. You also see an E7 on there. We haven't looked at just the regular E chord because that's a little difficult to play on a ukulele, but you might come across E7 more often. And then we have a B flat 7 in there, which is also a little bit trickier. That's a bar chord. You might not see that as frequently, but that's included in there too. Now I just want to note that if you don't hear the difference between the regular chord, the major chord, and the 7, that's okay. Just get used to playing those next to each other to see how those different chords sound. Or if you're playing a song and you know that the 5 says a 7, you could try doing it without the 7 so you see what it sounds like. Or if the 5 doesn't have a 7, you could see what it sounds like as a 7th chord. For example, something like When the Saints Go Marching In is a 1-4-5 progression. If I do it in C, when I go to that G chord, I might see how it sounds with just the regular G or the G7. So if I have When the Saints Go Marching In, when the saints go marching in. So that's just the G. Oh yes, I wanna be in that number. Oh, when the saints go marching in. Now I put in a 7th chord at the end. Because it had a nice pull, but I could have played the G7 instead of a G in other places. So I could have did When the Saints Go Marching In. Oh yes, I wanna be in that number. Oh, when the saints go marching in. That 7 chord at the end just adds more tension. So when the saints go marching in. You could end it that way with just the regular G7, with just the regular G, or with the G7. It sounds a little more final. Oh, when the saints go marching in. And sometimes I do those kind of endings at the end just to kind of repeat that phrase. Alright, so that's how you might use it if you're playing other songs, you know. But I also just want you to see that if you recognize it says a 7, you don't know that chord, try playing it with just a regular major chord. So you can experiment a little bit with that. Or if you're playing the progressions, if you're just going through 1-4-5s to practice, see how the regular chord versus the 7 sounds. And that's why on that handout I included the shapes for both the regular and the 7, so that you can play them back to back to see what the different chords sound like. So like an F and an F7. There's also an alternate fingering for the F7 on that sheet. And your F7. Okay, that's a quick example of some things you can do with the 7. Just recognizing what the 7 is and how it's most commonly used. And now for the last example, I'll show how the blues doesn't really follow that same rule. It uses a lot of 7s to create a completely different sound. So I'll show how it's could be used in blues music, or how you can play the 7th on different notes, but still use that 1-4-5 progression. Okay, in blues music, you might see that 7th all over the place. That could be on the 1, the 4, and the 5. And it just keeps pulling the song and adding more tension. Now, this was adopted in jazz music as a way to switch keys, where the 7th chord would be borrowed from another key. Now, I won't go into that sophisticated harmony there. That's its own language. But with the blues, you can see how it's going to sound with all 7 chords. So I'll do that 12-bar blues progression, one of the most common progressions you'll hear in blues music, with all 7 chords. And we'll see how it automatically sounds more bluesy than just the regular chords. So a great exercise to practice would be going through this 12-bar blues progression in the key of C. So here we go. It would sound like this. Repeating itself. And notice the 5 still has that sound that it wants to come back home. Then the 5, but it steps down in the 4. Then you might want to end on just the regular C. Sounds more final. Sometimes they add other extensions. So that's how it's used in blues music. You'll notice I did a little step down. That's called a turnaround. That's another common thing you'll hear in blues music, but that's for another time. So for now, you could work on that chord progression. You could also do the 1-4-5 and other chord progressions with 7th chords just to get a feel for it. So very quickly, key of G would be. So same feel. So it's a lot of fun to just play around with those chord progressions, and the more you play through them, the more you get an ear for how they're used in popular songs. Now with all these lessons, I'm not doing as many songs. I'm showing you what's going on in the songs, and you can look up how to play songs online or in songbooks. But if you're learning some of these tricks of what's going on in the songs, you're gonna realize how a lot of songs are similar, and how if you learn a few songs, it helps. You already know a lot of the chords and some of the chord progressions. So that was the 7th chord lesson. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good night.